Hi, my name is Dr. Bob Hendren. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, also see adults, so I guess that makes me a general psychiatrist. And it's a pleasure to be here, a bit belated, to the Stanford Adult Autism and DD Conference, sponsored by SFASA. I'm going to talk today about complementary and integrative approaches to autism spectrum disorder. I'm going to go fast through some areas. You're welcome to have these slides and to look at them. And so some of the things that I go through more quickly, you can spend more time looking at. I do research in several of the things that we'll be talking about today. I'm not going to promote any of them, but I will tell you about one study that I'm excited about. But for the most part, these are ways that I do research and that I have a research team that gets paid for the research we do. And I'm on some advisory boards that relate to some of the things that we talk about today. As I think everybody knows, the prevalence of autism has been going up. And it keeps going up. It doesn't somehow reach a peak and say, okay, now we've adjusted for what we've learned about autism or how we identify it. But certainly it seems to grow up in some areas more than others. It's thought that perhaps there may be two segments of autism, a more severe impairing kind of autism, and one that certainly has some things that are challenges, but like all of us have challenges, is something that people adjust to and would like to be accepted for. So we see an increase, a larger increase in that group that are more higher functioning, but we also see an increase in the group that has more severe autism. Both seem to be growing. And we think, how can we explain that? How can we understand why is it growing? We can think about increased recognition. We can think about a variety of other things, but it's not a genetic cause. Genetic causes don't increase like that. And it raises the question of whether there's some part of this all that has to do with environmental stressors. So the first vulnerability comes along with the genetic underpinnings. And autism is a genetic disorder. We don't know which genes. We think there's well over 100, and they come together in different ways. Not everybody has the same genes that has autism. And yet we know that that vulnerability exists, and things may trigger autism to develop at a particular point in time. Some of those things that might trigger it are environmental stressors, and we'll talk more about what those might be. And the interaction between the two, the stressor that affects the way the gene expresses itself and the way that it leads to genes interacting with each other in ways that might be different based on that environmental interaction. The third stress is when we think autism is not something we can do anything about. And a generation or two ago, people with autism were often put into restrictive environments that didn't give them the opportunity to learn reciprocity, to help develop their language, to do other things. And they didn't do as well as they are now doing when they are given the opportunity to develop skills that help with reciprocity and with social interactions. I've thought about this in a way about, what is this gene environment interaction? How does that work? And as I was thinking about it, I was in France and visiting some friends that live in Alsace. And you might recall that part of France, Alsace-Lorraine, had a glacier come down and scrape out the ground and create a valley. And they grow wine there. And the friends that we were visiting said, well, would you like to go to some wineries? We have good wine here in Alsace. I said, well, that'd be great. And as we went to the different wineries, they talked about their terroir. They talked about what went into the land, the clay and the sand and the volcanic ash and other things that happened in the unique way that Alsace-Lorraine was carved out. They said that those different layers of different things affect the way our grapes grow, but that's not it. That's not all of it. There's also the amount of rain and the amount of sunshine. They said that's not all of it either. It's also the souls of the people that are tilling the soil, that are putting into those grapes, the cepage. And that's what creates our terroir, and that's what creates our great wine. And I thought, well, that's kind of the way kids grow brains. And the way we see their brains, we see the symptoms, we see their phenotype, we see the outside on the surface, and we used to kind of think that was it. That's how we created diagnostic categories. And then we said, no, there's also the DNA, and that's at the core of the earth, and that affects things. And I think we've come to appreciate that now it's the way DNA expresses itself all the way up to the symptoms and the way that all those things interact. So when I was giving this talk, someone that is a strong behaviorist said, I said that to her, the problem in a way is if we do just behavioral things, we're working only in one area. And she said, oh no, Bob, if I get these people early enough, I can resculpt their neurons. I can make those things different. And that's why I put the arrows in on the endophenotype, saying that these things are mutually interactive, and doing something at one level also affects other levels and how we can make an intervention. If we think about the middle earth part, that the layer 2 that we showed, there are immune abnormalities, inflammation, oxidative stress, methylation, mitochondrial dysfunction, hormonal effects, microglia, the things that are in the gut, the microbiome, are all things that affect the way those genes express themselves and are potential areas for our intervention. If we were to think about making an intervention at each level, at the surface of the earth, we might be doing behavioral interventions or family support and structure. But as my colleague said, just working on layer 4 doesn't mean that's the only way that changes occur. We've learned that making behavioral changes can also affect the deeper levels. Layer 3 and 4, things like speech and language, occupational therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. Getting down a little further, we can think about how pharmacotherapy affects neurotransmitters. And going down even further, we can think about what that last layer was that I just mentioned, the things like immune function, oxidative stress. And then finally, we could think about what could we do for genes. And people may not feel ready for that yet, but certain disorders are doing that. So if we think about biomedical interventions, which is kind of what we're here to talk about in terms of complementary and integrative type approaches, we're going to talk about how to affect that layer, that level 2, those kinds of processes that may have to do with the body's resilience, that may affect the way genes express themselves and the way that we grow healthy grapes, or the way that deeper earth affects what comes out on the surface. We're going to talk about a number of interventions, and I'm going to grade them by talking about the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force that talked about A would be a high certainty of benefit, all the way down to an I, which is lacking evidence or even conflicting, and the level of certainty being low, moderate, and high. As we talk about some of these integrative and biomedical interventions and what's the evidence for them and whether they work or not. We first started thinking about what about growing brains? What about at the very beginning, from preconception through conception to the baby actually being born? And we started looking, and it was in part brought about by parents who maybe had a child with autism, and they said, we understand that if you have one child with autism, the risk for your sibling, the next kid born, might be anywhere between 10 and 20%. So what could we do to improve the odds if it's only 1 to 2% if you don't have anybody in the family with that? So we did a search looking at perinatal, those things from the beginning of pregnancy to the end of delivery, and autism. And we looked for things like infections and medications. We also searched for interventions that might improve the neurodevelopmental outcome, like nutritional supplements or breastfeeding. And I'll tell you more about what we found in just a minute. Our review is in agreement with other studies that were smaller, not looking quite as currently, but they supported the possibility that interventions to normalize or mitigate these processes, particularly in the preconception and perinatal period, might lead to resilience and health in the developing and newborn child. We looked at, again, at these conclusions and found that there are multiple interventions that might improve the outcomes. The risks were things like maternal infections and inflammation, things like congenital rubella. There were also things like environmental toxicants. If you have coal dust, it contains a lot of methylmercury. If you live downwind from a coal-burning plant, the incidence of neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism, is higher. PCBs, the lining in thermoses, toluene, arsenic, are all things. Living near a lot of air pollution, if you live near a freeway or a highway that has a lot of diesel dust, the incidence of neurodevelopmental disorders is higher. If you live near a field where they spray pesticides, the incidence is higher. Taking valproic acid, thalidomide, the thing that led to the flipper arms and legs in moms, if it's taken, if the moms took it for nausea during pregnancy. If it was taken at the end of the first trimester or the beginning of the second, they had a higher incidence of autism. SSRIs are controversial. Some studies have reported that maybe they're associated, but most recent large-scale studies say no, they're not. Acetaminophen, interestingly, Tylenol, has been associated with an increased incidence of autism, and heavy metals also. And then what could we do to help? How could we make a difference? So folic acid and supplementing with multivitamins and folic acid before and during pregnancy was associated with a reduced risk of autism. Before I came to UCSF, I was at UC Davis at the Mind Institute, and a number of the studies on folic acid were done there with a large number of children, showing a strong correlation between folic acid levels and the development of autism. Less strong, but still notable, are things like taking omega-3s, vitamin D, using antioxidants. For older moms that are iron deficient, taking iron, using choline. And a developmental pediatrician, Liz Mumper, had a lot of kids in her practice, over 300, that had autism. And the moms would often ask her, what could we do to improve the outcomes of our second born child, or third or fourth, but our next children? And what she did for her practice was to minimize exposure to toxicants, maximize breastfeeding, use probiotics, nutritional counseling, not necessarily a case in gluten-free diet, just a diet that was healthy, limited antibiotic use only when it was really essential, and she minimized acetaminophen use. And in the study that she published from this, 2005 to 2011, there were no new cases of autism in her practice. She has continued, she hasn't published that, but she says it continues to be a really low incidence of autism in her practice, when people follow this kind of diet. That's not proof positive. It's an associational study that there was no control group, but it gives a pause to think about what things could we do to improve outcomes. I'm going to skip this slide to say that there are a number of things that we've looked at that we think could be important in biomedical or integrative medicine kinds of treatments. I'm not going to talk about every one of them, but I put them up more for you to be able to think about all the different interventions and wonder what the evidence is for them. What I'm going to do, though, is talk about those that have the most evidence or that seem the most promising. So the ones in red, melatonin, omega-3, vitamin D3, and NAC, are ones that we'll talk a little more about because they seem to have enough evidence, not huge evidence, but evidence from more than one trial that they make a difference in how kids with autism do. Ones that look particularly promising and have a few studies are methyl B12. There's 2 studies of that's given injectably under the skin. Vitamin and mineral supplements are also gaining increasing evidence. And then those that have some evidence that are worth considering, and when I talk to parents about what would they like to try, if they're keen on trying these, I suggest that they might be worth trying, but to do it with someone who's knowledgeable in the techniques, things like diet or doing things for the microbiome. We currently have 2 studies right now that are multi-site studies looking at the microbiome in autism, pancreatic digestive enzymes. There was a multi-site trial that I think had promise, but still hasn't been approved by the FDA. CBD and THC, we're currently doing a trial of CBD with a little THC in it, the same compound that was approved to treat some kind of seizure disorders from a company called Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And probiotics seem to be somewhat helpful. And we'll talk about some of those in a little more detail as we go through. If we're talking about immune inflammation, we often think about melatonin being involved to help reset your body's clock so that you fall asleep at a better time, or at a, so that you're going to get 7 to 9 hours of sleep and help you sleep through the night. We'll talk more about melatonin and about vitamin D. And then mitochondrial function, you'll see there's not as much evidence for those kinds of interventions. So we won't talk about those. Not just because there isn't evidence doesn't mean they don't work. It just means the studies haven't been done. So for melatonin, there have been a number of reviews of different randomized controlled trials suggesting that it helps a lot. There's been some controversy about melatonin, concern that maybe people take too much of it or take it for too long. And it's particularly concerned that kids might not be able to pay attention as well the next day or might be a little fogged from the melatonin. The studies that talk about that for neurotypical kids, but many advisors talk about how kids with neurodevelopmental disorders don't have a regular sleep cycle. They need something like melatonin to help regulate that. People also find that melatonin comes on quickly and then goes away quickly after 3 or 4 hours, regular melatonin. And so they've developed a longer acting kind of melatonin that goes up quickly, but then comes down slowly, which is said to replicate the way the body handles melatonin. And for those people that are having trouble with their kid falling asleep or themselves, but then only sleeping for 3 to 4 hours, these controlled release medications that you can find online, they are available by prescription, but they don't have to be, to see how they do. And they observe no detrimental effects on development or withdrawal or safety issues in their use or in the discontinuation of the drug. Vitamin D has a few studies showing benefit. It gets a grade B. When someone has an interest in it, I think that that's worth trying. often it's helpful to get a vitamin D level first, and you can do that with a simple blood test. Although I found sometimes insurance companies don't pay for it. And so then sometimes it's worth just going ahead with maybe for younger kids, 1,000 international units, and for kids that are getting a little older, 2,000. But I know some people with low levels will go as high as 5,000 international units. And there does seem to be benefit for that from vitamin D. We mentioned mitochondrial dysfunction. It's only one study. It was 78 kids taking CoQ10, and they reported improvements in sleep and in gastrointestinal problems. Next kind of category thinks about oxidative stress. For things like curcumin, what goes into Indian food, glutathione, methyl B12, I'll tell you a little more about because it was a study we did. Tell you a little more about NAC because the conference is sponsored by Stanford, and NAC, the first study, and the one that to me is the most meaningful, was done by Antonio Harden. And then sulforaphane, where we did a study as well, which is concentrated broccoli sprout extract. The others listed up there just don't have enough evidence to go into. When I was being interviewed to be the executive director at the Mind Institute, some of you might know the Mind was founded by parents of children with autism. And they raised, or together we raised, about $100 million and built a really nice building with labs and clinics and educational spaces and other things in there. But when they first interviewed me, they said, you know, we'd really like you to leave no stone unturned about what might cause autism and how it might be treated. We'd like you to do good science, but we want you to keep an open mind. So I thought that was a good pathway, and I appreciated that opportunity to go in that direction. And as we thought about what to study, I would talk to some kind of alternative treatment people that were doing different kinds of things for autism, and said, what do you think we should study in a randomized controlled trial? They, several of them said, we'd really like you to study chelation. I said, well, you know, that's the controversial one. I don't think I want to start off with that. And it's complicated to sterilize the gut. You might take out other heavy metals. So I said, what's next? They said methyl B12. I didn't know much about it. I recall people taking methyl B12 when they were older, but this is given sub-Q and it lasts for a while. And I thought it seemed interesting to give a try. And we had oxidative stress biomarkers that could be done by a collaborator that in another lab that could do it well. When we were doing the trial, I was a skeptic in a way, but the second kid who came in, when I'd seen him first, he looked like, you know, he was like there was a veil over him, or there was a sense that his eyes weren't quite clear. He wasn't quite recognizing what was going on around him. He wasn't connecting. And after about a month, he came in, and it was like this veil had been lifted, that he was looking at me. And I said to his parents, do you think he's different now? And they said, really with tears in their eyes, they said, oh yes, he's very different. He's like awakened. He's more alert. Now, he still had autism, and he still has autism. But there was a sense that it helped make him healthier. It got rid of, or helped reduce, oxidative stress and helped him do better in that way. So it convinced me that there may be ways that we could make kids more resilient and make them healthier, to push back, in a sense, if there was a gene-environment interaction going in a not healthy way, like a plant growing not straight, but growing towards the light, or growing in another way, could we make it work better? And we found that in both of our methyl B12 trials, that they showed significance in terms of separating from placebo. the NAC study, N-acetylcysteine, NAC sometimes used to treat Tylenol overdose, but Dr. Harden thought of using it for treating repetitive or self-injurious behaviors in kids with autism. And he had 33 patients, and the active separated from the placebo, and it was well tolerated. There have been a number of studies since. Some of them haven't been as significant in terms of their improvement, but others have, and generally people say it's really helpful for SIBs, self-injurious behaviors, and may be helpful for OCD. Sulforaphane, as I'd mentioned before, is really concentrated broccoli sprout extract. You'd have to take so much broccoli that you'd have to eat way too much of it, but we brought it down, and this sulforaphane also seems to help oxidative stress. But we wondered if it might help in other ways as well. And we do an outcome study and consult with the Oak Hill School in San Anselmo, and there we have a built-in outcome trial. But there we also started the sulforaphane trial and used metabolomic biomarkers that looked at urinary metabolites. And we showed that those who had the most of those things, where it says 77 under results, those things, the most of them, and showed the most improvement, showed significant improvement in the aberrant behavior checklist and in the social responsiveness scale. And those metabolites were things like oxidative stress, amino acid related to the gut microbiome, neurotransmitters, hormones, and interestingly, sphingomyelin, which is a lot of what makes up white matter, which we know has is often abnormal in some people with autism. So we felt sulforaphane was worthwhile. There have been other studies since that show benefits, some not as much benefits, and referrals or references to those additional studies are given at the bottom. There's lots of multivitamins that seem to be helpful. We haven't studied them enough to fully know, although omega-3s have enough to get a grade B, folinic acid, grade C, vitamin D, and we'll talk more about some of those now. The omega-3s have been helpful for brain development. They multiple trials have shown modest improvements in social awareness, social motivation, other kinds of communicating. Those aren't big improvements, but they're significant when they're done for a while. And those trials have been continue on, but you can see references to them below. And that first one was one that we did actually by sending omega-3 through the mail, either placebo or omega-3, to families that signed up and filled out information, and showed a significant improvement. An interesting study too, done by Richard Fry, looked at folinic acid in language and communication. That study that you see there showed that kids that were having trouble with language seemed to show improvements in that. And based on that, he has a 3-site grant from NIH to look at folinic acid intervention with a placebo-controlled group. I'm on the DSMB. I don't know whether the kids are, I'm reviewing the grant. I don't know if they're on active or placebo, but some kids seem to be doing better. And we'll see if those are the kids that are on the active, suggesting that at least something's happening in the trial. If we think about the microbiome, we're going to talk about that a little more with probiotics and pancreatic digestive enzymes. The way that we've learned about the GI tract and the microbiome started with mouse models and showed improvement in the Bacteroides fragilis, which is a probiotic, and that the mouse models actually dropped those behaviors and things that looked like autism in a mouse. And now there have been other trials of microbiota transfer therapy, where children get their guts cleaned out antibiotics that make it so it's somewhat sterile. Then you place a capsule with sterilized feces from a healthy person in the rectum, and these kids showed a 80% reduction in GI symptoms, but they also showed behavioral improvements and symptoms as well, and they persisted for 8 weeks. The trial is still ongoing, and there are others that are trying to find a less complicated way of doing it. But that was at Arizona State. It's still just a research study to enter. But I've had patients go to Australia and be able to get the treatment there. Not all of them come back saying that it worked, but it is something that parents who want to consider it can find places to go and studies perhaps to enter. A study that we're interested in looked at an absorbent that coats a neurometabolite in the gut that irritates the gut lining, makes that through that irritation, the juncture get wider and leak the kinds of things that are in the gut that would create problems. And theoretically, that all of those things come together to make a healthier gut and then a healthier child through this inert substance that's not a drug. It's not anything that causes any serious side effects. And they've done studies in New Zealand and in Australia that have been published, and you can see the reference to them below. And there's a multi-site study now looking at doing this. The problem with it is kids need to be pretty irritable. They need to be high on an irritability scale, but they also can't be taking antipsychotics. So they need to be between 13 and 17. But it's an interesting study trying to look at the gut and look at how we can treat that in a way. The effect size was as high for this intervention as for Abilify. So for parents who are saying, okay, I'm willing to give up the antipsychotics, I'd like to see if we can do something for the gut. And you don't have to have gut problems, you just need to have the irritability. But it's an interesting study that has a couple other publications that say it has some promise, or at least is worth trying. Pancreatic digestive enzymes has been studied over the last several years, but has still not been approved by the FDA. They're considering it at this point. Other considerations are things like GABA, some of the things that go into benzodiazepines. Those have been thought of, vitamins and mineral supplements, and acupuncture all have some kind of a role. The medical marijuana, I'd mentioned THC or CBD, the multi-site study that's looking at the endocannabinoid system, what it has to do with social reward. I have parents that have told me over the years that I used to be willing to prescribe it after they'd kind of tried everything else, and that their child was really aggressive and having difficulties. I'd say for the most part, just based on that, people show a little bit of improvement, some improvement, but it's not enough by itself, and it doesn't work miracles. But the CBD studies is moving ahead, and there is some preliminary evidence saying that maybe it could be helpful, and maybe thinking about how best to give it to people that don't have side effects of interfering with cognition. The other kind of thing that I wonder about, and I'm concerned about as we think about adults with autism, is this study that showed as a kind of case control in looking at Medicaid data that people with autism tended to develop dementia at a higher rate and at a younger age compared to the general population. The study has some faults with it. It took it a while to get published. I reviewed it twice. And then finally it was published in the Journal of Autism Research. And at least raises the concern if we think about things like frontotemporal dementia, or we think about dementia with Down syndrome, that what if this does happen earlier because of a in a sense, a brain that might be more vulnerable to it or to another wave of changes. How are we going to deal with that? What could we do to help kids as they become young adults or middle-aged adults to do the best that they can? And you wonder about whether there's a nutritional way to do that as well. Dale Beredson, who was the director at the Buck Institute, is a neurologist, a professor of neurology, and he had developed something called NeuroQ. I'm not promoting it. I'm just saying here's an example of something that he feels helps and is published to say that it helps with dementia. And you wonder, are there other ways that we can do to help our kids with autism that may be heading towards dementia earlier, and to help their brain be more resilient and to do better. There are a variety of different integrative medicine treatments that I'm not going to drill down on. I put them in more to be part of your slide set if you're interested. But in thinking about integrative medicine for sleep, there's all those things at the top, like herbal remedies, amino acids, relaxation, meditation, guided imagery, yoga, but also things like valerian root, St. John's wort, kava, passion flower, GABA, and 5-HTP. No evidence, I mean, there's anecdotal evidence, but not good published trials of those benefits. But people who say, yeah, it made a difference for them or for their child. And then for anxiety, some of those same things come up, like passion flower, valerian root, magnesium, variety of other kinds of things that might be considered, and you'll find integrative medicine docs using to try to be helpful for anxiety without going to prescription medications. So in conclusion, I'd say that there are those biomedical or KIM treatments with the most evidence to say, yeah, you could try these if you wanted, or melatonin, omega-3, vitamin D, and NAC. Those with some evidence and maybe promise might be if parents are particularly interested in thinking about methyl B12, sulforaphane, folinic acid, or folic acid, for families that are interested in trying them. But to do that with somebody who knows what they're doing and knows how to work it. It's not saying that those things that are not getting recommended or that there's no evidence doesn't mean the lack of evidence says there's no efficacy. It just says it hasn't been studied, and it's hard to find funding for these studies. Many of the studies I do have been funded by donors, by people who are really interested in doing these studies, because in big pharmaceutical companies, there isn't the kind of separation, and it takes a long time to do the trials for them to make the money to pay back what it costs, which is a lot of money to do randomized controlled trials. So just because there isn't something published doesn't mean it's not efficacious. So, I talked in that methyl B12 story that I told about lifting the veil of autism. I feel for those of us who know kids with autism well, and I think parents especially know kids with autism well, they know this kid in there. They may be filtered through autism, and sometimes that's part of what makes them so lovable, or they say things in such a really nice way, or they have certain things. There are other times, though, when it's more challenging, but this veil filters the kid. There's a kid in there, and I worry sometimes that people that are working with folks with autism only see the autism. They don't see the kid. And if we can do things to make the kid more resilient and to lift that veil, then I think we can help the kid come out more through loving relationships, through helping them learn ways to relate and to relate more to the world. It's thinking of doing that, we kind of intervene on all levels. There's the medical level of thinking about what involvement of genetics does that have, neurology, GI, other medical symptoms, speech, language therapy, behavioral, treating associated symptoms with pharmacology, thinking about biomedical assessments and treatments that we've talked about mostly today. But the key is really building personal relationships and resilience, which are all encompassing, appreciating that person with autism, finding ways to help them interact more with the world, are the real keys. The other things help do that, but in the end, it's trying to help them live as fully as they can. The practical takeaways, I think I've hit enough, and I don't need to go through any more. But the idea is that this is kind of a whole body or integrated treatment that's trying to work at all these levels and to help the body be as healthy as possible, not just working at one level medications or one level behavioral treatments, but thinking about what might benefit somebody the most at multiple levels. At the Mind Institute, when the building was being built, we had an art contest. We asked people from all over the world that had a neurodevelopmental disorder to submit things that they have done, art that they have done. The people doing that ranged in age from 3 up to about 84. And it was a juried show. The artists who were jurying it would pick things that they thought were the best, and there were 80 hanging in the Mind Institute. This one is one of my favorites. It was done by a boy who was 4 at the time. I still see him. He's in his late 20s now. But it's called The Haircut. And you can see how he's feeling about getting a haircut, the expression on his face. You can see probably the barber up there cutting his hair. And the bee is probably the buzz of a razor. But his mother said in the things that he drew at that time in his life, he always showed an escape route, a way out. And you can see the door over on the right-hand side that was his escape route. I hope that as we begin to think about ways of building the body's resilience, helping the body push back in this gene environment struggle to be the most healthy and to have the best kind of whole body health, that we can help kids be the best that they can be as fully who they are. And if there's part of their autism that's really good, then I hope that we can find ways that we preserve that. And if there are some other parts that interfere with their being able to live life as fully as they might, I hope we can help that become less of an issue and less distressing to them and to their families as well. So I've appreciated this opportunity to talk to you. I gave this talk once before. I'm giving it again. It's I hope that we all have a chance to meet in person someday, and I hope that this can be helpful as you think about ways to help your loved ones with autism. Thank you.